If you think camping is all about fresh air and peaceful nights, think again, because tonight's stories will make you hesitate before stepping into the woods again. From a campfire that mysteriously disappeared in the dead of night, to eerie whispers echoing from an abandoned ranger station, to something unimaginable stalking campers through Yellowstone, these true stories are not for the faint-hearted. Each tale comes from real people who lived through moments they wish they could forget. So sit tight, keep the lights on, and get ready for 3 disturbing true camping horror stories from the USA. 1. The Vanishing Campfire at Blackwood Ridge. 2. Whispers from the Abandoned Ranger Station. 3. The Thing That Followed Us Through Yellowstone. 1. The Vanishing Campfire at Blackwood Ridge. I still remember the first time I heard this story. And even now it sends a cold shiver down my spine. Because nothing about it feels exaggerated or far-fetched. It sounds like the kind of nightmare that slips into reality when you least expect it. It happened to 2 friends, Mark and Dylan, who decided to spend a weekend exploring Blackwood Ridge, a quiet stretch of forest in northern Montana that locals casually warned visitors about, though no one ever gave a clear reason why. The warnings always came with a vague shrug, almost as if people wanted to speak, but couldn't bring themselves to spill the whole truth. Anyway, Mark and Dylan, being adventurous and tired of the usual trails, figured the eerie reputation was nothing more than wildfire rumors or old ghost tales meant to keep kids from wandering too far. They packed light, drove out before sunrise, and reached the ridge just as the morning mist was lifting off the ground like slow, moving smoke. Everything looked normal at first, almost calm, almost too calm, and after a few hours of hiking, they found a small, flat clearing where they decided to set up camp for the night. The place felt isolated but harmless, with tall pines surrounding them like quiet guardians and a small stream trickling nearby. As the sun dipped behind the trees, they built a fire, cooked dinner, and talked about the usual stuff: work, life, old memories, future plans. Nothing strange, nothing out of place. But sometime after midnight, things took an odd turn. Out of nowhere, the woods grew completely silent, as if someone had hit a mute button on the entire forest. No insects, no wind, no rustling leaves, just a heavy, unnatural stillness settling around them, thick enough to make their ears ring. They tried brushing it off, but both of them felt the same prickling at the back of their necks, the kind that warns you something is watching. Before they could even talk about it, the fire in front of them suddenly flickered, dimmed, and died out. Not slowly, not naturally, but instantly, as if someone had smothered it with an invisible blanket. Mark swore he saw a shadow pass behind the flames just a heartbeat before they vanished, though he could never clearly describe what it looked like. He just kept saying it was wrong, like it didn't move the way a person or animal would. The darkness that followed was so complete it almost felt physical, like a weight pressing against their chests. They grabbed their flashlights, only to find both refusing to turn on, despite full batteries. Their phones wouldn't light up either, leaving them stranded in a darkness deeper than anything they'd ever felt. And then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling their camp with a crunching rhythm in the leaves, stopping now and then, as if whoever, or whatever it was, wanted them to know it was there. Dylan tried calling out, thinking maybe they were dealing with a lost hiker or a ranger, but the footsteps didn't respond. They only paused, then resumed their slow pacing, drawing closer with each pass. The air grew colder, so cold their breath turned to mist, and yet the night wasn't supposed to drop below freezing. In the middle of the panic, Dylan felt something tug at his back sharp, quick, like a hand yanking it from behind. But when he spun around, there was no one there, nothing but the pitch black void. They didn't even pack up their gear. They just grabbed whatever they could reach and started running, stumbling through the forest with no light, no sense of direction, and that same thing tailing them at an unsettling, steady pace. Mark claimed he heard a low, guttural breathing just inches from his ear at one point, though when he turned, all he saw was more darkness stretching endlessly behind them. Somehow, after what felt like hours, they burst out onto an old service road illuminated by the faint moonlight, and the moment their feet hit gravel, the sound stopped. No footsteps, no breathing, no movement in the trees behind them. Just silence. Not the strange, suffocating silence from before, but the natural quiet of the woods at night. They didn't waste another second. They followed the road until they reached their car, tossed their gear inside, and drove off without looking back. Days later, when they finally returned with a few rangers to collect the rest of their things, they found their campsite exactly as they'd left it, except for one detail that still haunts them to this day. The fire pit, which had been surrounded by stones and filled with charred wood, now looked untouched, spotless, and completely cold, like no fire had ever been burned there. The stones were rearranged in a neat circle, almost ritual-like, and right in the center was a perfectly smooth patch of soil with no ashes, no soot, nothing. One ranger muttered under his breath that he'd seen this before, but when Mark tried to ask him what he meant, the man just shook his head and walked away. After that, Mark and Dylan never went camping again. Not in Montana, not anywhere. They couldn't shake the feeling that something followed them out of those woods. Something that didn't want them lighting a fire in that clearing. Something that made sure they understood they weren't welcome. And every now and then, late at night, Mark swears he hears those same slow footsteps outside his window, pacing just like they did around the camp, waiting for a moment when the lights go out, too. Whispers from the abandoned ranger station. The story of the abandoned ranger station starts with a couple, Jenna and Lewis, who were driving through the dense forests of Oregon in early fall, chasing that crisp air and golden leaves people dream about when they think of the perfect outdoor escape. But little did they know, they were about to stumble into a place that locals whispered about with uneasy glances and tight lips. They had planned a short hike followed by a calm evening in the woods, nothing too adventurous, just enough to take a break from city noise and breathe in something real for a change. As they followed a narrow dirt road deeper into the trees, they noticed the forest becoming strangely quiet, as if every sound had been swallowed by something lurking in the shadows, yet they kept going, thinking maybe the silence was just part of the wilderness atmosphere. Eventually, the road opened to a small clearing where an old wooden building sat crookedly between towering pines, its roof sagging in the middle, windows broken, and a faded sign barely hanging from a single rusted nail, Black Hollow Ranger Station. The place looked deserted for at least 2 decades, maybe longer, but curiosity nudged them forward, and despite a strange heaviness in the air, they decided to take a look around before setting up their camp nearby. As they walked up the creaking steps of the porch, Jenna swore she felt a faint vibration under her feet, like someone lightly knocking from inside the floorboards, though Lewis brushed it off as her imagination playing games with the old wood shifting. They pushed open the door, which groaned like a wounded animal, and inside, the place looked frozen in time. Dusty maps pinned to the walls, a radio lying on the ground with its wires ripped out, a chair turned over, and a thick layer of grime covering everything. But the strangest part was the notebook sitting perfectly centered on the main desk, untouched by dust, as if someone had placed it there moments before they arrived. Against their better judgment, they opened it, expecting to see old logs or patrol notes, but instead they found frantic, messy handwriting filling every page. Short entries, incomplete sentences, and repeated phrases like "not alone," "don't listen to the voice," and "it comes after dark." Lewis frowned, confused, but Jenna felt her heart drop into her stomach because right at the bottom of one page, written shakily and almost carved into the paper, were the words, "It knows you're reading this." Even with daylight still filtering through the broken windows, the air inside the station suddenly felt icy, as if something unseen had entered the room with them. They put the notebook down, ready to leave, but as they turned toward the door, a soft whisper drifted from the back of the room. So faint they couldn't make out the words, but definitely human, definitely close. Lewis called out, thinking maybe there was someone hiding inside, maybe a squatter or someone injured, but the whisper stopped abruptly, and a heavy silence blanketed the station like a suffocating fog. They slowly backed out of the building, trying to shake off the chill spreading through their bodies, and once outside, they decided to make camp farther away, not wanting to spend the night near that disturbing place. But fate had other plans. After sunset, As the orange sky faded into deep blue and the forest thickened into darkness, the whispers returned. Not distant, not faint, but close, circling their tent like someone murmuring just inches from the fabric. At first they thought it might be animals rustling around, but the whispers formed words, disjointed and eerie, repeating their names, calling them softly with a strange familiarity that made their blood run cold. Lewis unzipped the tent, flashlight in hand, but the moment he stepped out, the light flickered, dimmed, and died completely, leaving the woods in a darkness so dense it felt like they were submerged underwater. Jenna grabbed his arm, trembling, because right then, the whispers grew louder, clearer, almost angry, coming from all directions, overlapping like multiple voices speaking at once. And then, from somewhere back toward the ranger station, they heard a sharp wooden crack, like a door slamming. It echoed through the forest, followed by a dragging sound, slow and deliberate, as if something enormous was scraping across the floor inside that forgotten building. They didn't wait to find out what it was. In a panic, they grabbed only the essentials, abandoned the rest, and ran blindly through the trees, guided only by the faint glow of the moon filtering through the branches. With every step, the whispers chased them, fading in and out, sometimes ahead of them, sometimes behind, as if whatever was lurking inside that ranger station had no physical form and could move freely through the darkness. Jenna tripped more than once, scraping her hands on rocks and roots, but Lewis pulled her up each time, refusing to stop. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, the forest thinned and they stumbled onto the road where their car was parked. The moment they crossed that invisible threshold, the whispers vanished, cut off abruptly like a radio being switched off. They fumbled with the keys, jumped inside, and sped off without once looking into the rear-view mirror. When they finally reached a nearby town, shaken and breathless, they found a small diner still open and went inside, desperate for some sense of normalcy. As they told the waitress what happened, she listened quietly, her expression turning more serious with every word. When they mentioned the ranger station, she froze, set the coffee pot down slowly, and said in a low voice, "You shouldn't have gone near that place. Rangers abandoned it years ago after one patrol team vanished without a trace. People say someone, or something, still calls for help from inside." Jenna felt her skin crawl, and Lewis went pale, realizing the whispers they heard weren't meant to scare them away. They were meant to lure them inside. To this day, neither of them has returned to the woods, and sometimes, late at night, Jenna swears she still hears her name being whispered softly, like an echo drifting from somewhere far away. Or maybe not far enough. 3. The thing that followed us through Yellowstone. When people talk about Yellowstone, they picture geysers blasting steam into the sky, crystal, clear lakes reflecting mountains like mirrors, and wildlife roaming freely under wide blue skies. But for my friends and me, that trip carved itself into our memories for a very different reason, one we still struggle to explain without our voices shaking or our eyes drifting toward dark corners, half expecting whatever followed us that night to show up again. It started as a simple weekend trip, just 4 of us, Evan, Chris, Mara, and me, ready to unplug from life and soak in some adventure before fall rolled in and swallowed the warmth. We reached the park early in the afternoon, excitement buzzing through the air as we drove past towering pines and winding roads that looked like they'd been plucked straight from a postcard. After setting up camp near one of the quieter trails, we spent the day hiking, laughing, taking pictures, and pretending the world outside didn't exist. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest seemed to shift, almost like the trees themselves leaned in closer, listening, waiting, changing the very atmosphere around us. We didn't catch it at first, not until the temperature dropped sharply, way too fast for early evening and the usual night sounds. The crickets, the rustling leaves, the occasional call of distant animals faded into an unsettling stillness. It wasn't the kind of peaceful silence that makes you breathe deep. It was the kind that tightens your chest, makes your heartbeat suddenly feel too loud, too exposed, as if something unseen had awakened just beyond the reach of the firelight. We tried ignoring it, chalking it up to nerves or the cold, but everything inside our bodies told us something was wrong. Later, as we sat around the fire after dinner, swapping stories, Mara paused mid-sentence, her eyes widening slightly as she stared past us. I figured she was joking or maybe saw a deer. But when I turned to look, I saw nothing. Yet the expression on her face told me she wasn't playing around. She said she heard footsteps just behind the tree line, slow and dragging, like someone walking through thick mud even though the ground was bone dry. Chris grabbed his flashlight and scanned the trees, but the beam hit nothing except branches swaying gently, though there was no wind. The uneasiness grew with every passing minute, and when the fire suddenly popped loudly, louder than normal, we all flinched like it was a warning shot. A few minutes later, the unmistakable sound of twigs snapping echoed from behind us, not once, but twice, as if something heavy had stepped on them deliberately. Not wanting to panic, Evan suggested we stay calm, maybe pack things inside the tent and call it a night early. That was our first mistake, because the moment we zipped up the tent and the fire outside dimmed, the real horror began. At first it was the breathing. Slow, raspy, wet, sounding breaths that circled the tent like whatever was out there had no concern about being heard. Then came the scratching, light at first almost curious, at the sides of the tent, dragging from one end to the other as if fingers were trailing along the fabric, testing it. Mara grabbed my arm, trembling so badly I thought she might faint, and Chris whispered, "Don't move," as if staying still would somehow make us invisible. None of us dared to look outside. The breathing grew louder, deep and uneven, like whatever was out there had lungs too large or too damaged to function properly. Then suddenly, the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was much worse because it felt like the thing had stopped to listen, to figure out exactly where we were. And then, directly above our heads, something pressed down on the top of the tents, lowly, deliberately, making the fabric sag inward only a few inches, but enough for us to see the shape of long, stretched fingers pressing through the thin material. Mara let out a tiny gasp before covering her mouth with both hands, tears rolling down her cheeks. The weight lingered for a few seconds, then lifted, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps moving slowly away into the dark. We didn't move a muscle for at least 10 minutes, barely even breathing, terrified the slightest noise would bring it back. Eventually, Chris whispered that we should make a run for the car, but we had no idea where the creature had gone or if it was still lurking. Still, staying inside the tent felt like waiting to be caught. So when the footsteps seemed far enough away, we unzipped the tent as quietly as possible and bolted toward the car, stumbling, tripping, practically throwing ourselves inside before locking the doors. I wish I could say the nightmare ended there, but it didn't. As we sat trembling in the backseat, trying to convince ourselves we were safe, something moved at the edge of the parking area. Something tall, hunched, with limbs too long for its body and eyes reflecting light in a way no animal should. It stood there for a moment, watching us, its head tilting unnaturally as if studying us with unsettling curiosity. Then it stepped backward and melted into the trees, vanishing without a single sound. We left the park before sunrise, hardly speaking, the air in the car thick with fear. Even when we reached home, the sense of being watched lingered, like the creature hadn't fully let go. For weeks, each of us had strange dreams. Dark forests, heavy breathing behind us, long fingers reaching through shadows. And even now, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, convinced something is standing just outside my window. We don't talk about Yellowstone anymore, not because we've forgotten, but because remembering makes us feel like whatever followed us might hear its story being told and come looking again.